Hello and welcome to another special interview with me, Anne Diamond, for Viking.TV. From wherever you're watching this in the world, I do hope you're keeping safe and well, and that some sense of normality in the way we're all living seems at least 1 week nearer. Here in Britain, we are enduring another of those notorious July weeks that should be hot and sunny, but so far is really just cold, windy and wet. So if you are somewhere warmer and jollier, then frankly, you're not missing much. But if there is one thing you can count upon with the British weather, which is, of course, the cultural reason why we Brits talk about it so much, is that it can change suddenly. It never seems to be consistent. So the sun will come out again soon, and let us hope we will all be able to travel soon, so that people from all over the world can take wonderful holidays. Well, today you're going to have to rely on me as your holiday guide, because I'm going to transport you to one of the most fantastic locations on the planet, a fairy tale venue that you will feel probably very familiar with, even if you've never, ever been there. Welcome to Highclere Castle, nestled amongst the rolling hills and the lush fields of rural Hampshire and Berkshire. It's, just in case you don't know your geography that well, it's towards the South Midlands, I guess, of England, about an hour away from London, but a world away from the busy capital. You no doubt recognise it as Downton Abbey, from the long-running TV series and, of course, the movie. And, I'm told, or is widely rumoured, a second movie coming up. But behind the glorious facade, inside the stone walls of this amazing castle, lives a real family whose job and vocation it is to keep the castle going and functioning successfully in the 21st century. Mindful always, of course, of the amazing history within. So please let me introduce my special guest today, the 8th Earl of Carnarvon, George Herbert, known to family and friends as Geordie. Lord Carnarvon, welcome to Viking.TV.
And good evening. Great to be with you from the library at Highclere Castle. The library so well known in the Downton Abbey show. And actually, we've had a nice sunny afternoon.
Oh, I'm glad it's sunny for you. It's horrible here. But yes, and actually, doesn't the sun light up that beautiful ceiling? And all of those books, how many books in that library?
There's low numbers of thousands of glorious classics books here, of everything from geography, history, Egyptology, politics, literature, you name it, it's all here.
And of course, the ultimate question, have you read all of them?
Sadly not. I wouldn't even begin to. It would be great just to be able to be so relaxed that I could spend time in the libraries if I was a student again, just looking through these wonderful old books. But life's not quite like that at the moment.
It isn't it, funnily enough? I was talking about lockdown, but in actual fact, last Sunday was your first tentative step back out into the real world, because you opened Highclere to visitors, didn't you, last Sunday? How did it go?
We did. We opened on our published first summer open day, which was great to be able to do. And it actually went very well, albeit with some new organisation for the coronavirus guidance. We fully realised we wouldn't have as many people as normal, but I think those that came really had a great time, and
yes,
it all went pretty smoothly.
We've got some wonderful pictures, certainly of the exterior, and Highclere did look its best on Sunday. It was a lovely sunny day, wasn't it?
It was, and people really enjoyed all the wonderful things outside here around our wonderful gardens and the newly adapted sort of outdoor tea rooms and the gin bar and the ice creams. It was a fantastic day, really.
For you guys, the family inside, as I was saying, it must have been tremendously reassuring to see people back.
It was, because actually it's been a real challenge. I mean, coronavirus is an absolute serious calamity for humanity, for the world as a whole, and many people in the UK, and it really changes all sorts of people's lives. And it just was great for the house to somehow be open again, have some life back in it. It was so dark for so long, and I know this has happened to all heritage attractions. Very sadly, the arts, theatre, museums, everything has been so closed down by COVID-19, and it was a great privilege for us to at least be able to be open again. And even if we're operating at 4 cylinders rather than 8, it was just so good to be open. Welcome people.
What was it like? Can you remember what it was like, that moment when you heard the Prime Minister give that announcement that we as a country were going to go into lockdown? What was it like for you and Lady Carnarvon? What did you think?
Well, we had been getting more and more apprehensive over the previous fortnight as the news became more and more grim and foreboding about the virus. And then, of course, suddenly it dawned on us that our life has been literally turned upside down 180 degrees, and there will be no one around at all. And we have to shut down completely. And how are we going to look after our wonderful team here, and what's going to happen to them? And so it was all pretty serious stuff. And of course, you know, nowadays we're not the only people, but whether you're an airline or a wonderful place like Highclere, you sell lots of tickets on the online system, and it's great that the machine can do the work. But when you have to try and communicate with thousands of people with just 2 or 3 of you, in reverse, it's quite a challenge.
Yes, and of course, not only is it an enormous castle with goodness knows how many rooms. I think there are so many rooms you actually don't know how many rooms there are. But there's also a working farm, and there's all that farmland around you.
Yes, Highclere is a glorious estate. It's a great privilege to be here, and we've been farming ourselves here without any tenants actually since my father came back from the war in 1945. And the farming side has been able to keep going and in the normal way, and we're soon coming up to harvest. And we've had the sheep have had their lambs, the small amount of wonderful English lot pigs have had their piglets, the 2 or 3 mares have had their foals. So nature has continued on in the normal way, and the farm continues normally. It's just so sad that the part of the estate which involves in welcoming people has had to shut down.
Mm-hmm. So, of course, you've had to think about social distancing and the normal way that people look around the castle itself. What sort of changes have you had to make?
Well, I think the key ones are to try and adapt things so that people are just the right distance apart, and they can't be sort of crossing each other backwards and forwards. So we've had a fun adaptation to the dining room, where you actually come in as if you're one of the family on the proper entrance to it, and you leave as if you're Mr. Carson and his team through the green baize door on the other. And we've got a wonderful picture that now takes up part of the servery area of the Downton kitchen, Mrs. Patmore. Right? And then they head downstairs towards the Egyptian exhibition or out of the castle. So we kept that going in one way.
Oh yes, there they are, absolutely. Yeah. So
and the other thing which is fun is that you now have a bit of an improvement around the bedrooms, because you actually go into the dressing rooms and bedrooms and see a little bit more of them to keep everyone going in one direction upstairs on the first floor. So you can see where Lord and Lady Grantham used to be when those scenes were shot in the castle bedroom.
Yeah, I mean, so many people will be looking at these pictures now and, of course, associate your castle, which is your family pile, with Downton Abbey. But, of course, it is so much more to you than that. So let's talk a bit of family history. First of all, then, how old is that castle? And presumably there was something there even before that castle was built.
Well, there's been actual human habitation on the whole area around here all the way back to Iron Age time, because we have these fascinating Iron Age forts on top of the chalk downs here on Beacon Hill and Sydenham Hill. But the first time there was really a sort of proper building here was when the great Bishop of Winchester, William of Wykeham, he built a summer palace for himself on this site around the time of 1360s, 1370s. And he even cut down a lot of the oak trees here to build the first college at Oxford. He built New College at Oxford from oak at Highclere. Oh. As well, of course, being famous for starting Winchester College and helping with Windsor Castle. But of course, through the ages, the building has adapted and changed. But around the fireplace in the saloon was still the heart of the bishop's medieval summer palace there.
And it's still the heart of the castle, basically, isn't it?
It's still the heart of the castle today. And of course, it morphed into a glorious gentleman's residence of a Georgian house in the 1700s, and then later the current castle was built in the 1840s for my ancestor, the third Earl, who wanted to change what most people would have been very happy with, a great Georgian mansion, into something that was a Gothic Italian original creation that reminded him of his trips to northern Italy. And of course, Charles Barry, who built the House of Parliament at the same time, as a young man, used to go around Italy drawing all the amazing Italian buildings and learning his trade as a draftsman and then an architect.
And that's, of course, why they say Highclere is Italianate. It is very, very pretty, apart, if that isn't a demeaning word. It is utterly beautiful. And, of course, at the minute people hear right now that it was sort of designed by the same architect who designed the Houses of Parliament, Charles Barry, you can see you can see how similar they are in style. You look at Highclere there, absolutely beautiful, goodness knows, calling it a family home. And then you look at the Houses of Parliament, and honestly, without Big Ben, it could almost be the same building from certain angles, couldn't it?
It's quite a similar style, and if you go to those northern Tuscan towns like Lucca and places, similar buildings. And again, in Venice, if you look at sort of snapshot with your eyes of the Doge's palace, you can see some of the window design is the same as you look up in the saloon. So you can see where it all comes from.
What stone is it? Because it gleams golden in the sunshine.
It actually comes from a quarry near Bath, and we never quite know the exact one because somehow that was lost in the mist of time. And even though Charles Barry's records with the Institute of Architects doesn't have the exact quarry. When we've had to use stone for fixing the upper parts of the building, you see some newer little patches. We have to hope the weather just weathers it, because often it's quite slightly different shade when it comes.
Well, he chose well because it so belongs in the countryside that surrounds it. Now, I know we're going to get a lot of questions from people saying, why are you called Lord Carnarvon when you're not Welsh and your family seat isn't in Wales?
A key point, Anne. In fact, Carnarvon actually doesn't really come from the Welsh spelling of the word. It comes from the earlier Earls of Carnarvon, which are the Dormer family, and they basically were Robert Dormer was killed as an Earl of Carnarvon fighting for King Charles in the Battle of Newbury, of all places. And very sadly, that family, the Dormer family's title, Earl of Carnarvon, died out, I think, from lack of sons. And then when my ancestor was offered a peerage by George III, this is when he was Colonel Herbert, he chose the Carnarvon name again because that earlier Earl of Carnarvon had been married to a Herbert lady, so there was a connection.
Ah, I see. And so the Carnarvons have been ever since, and you're the 8th, I'm right, aren't you?
Yes, I'm the 8th from the first one was in the very early 1790s, and I'm the 8th.
And traditionally, the heir to that title is always called Lord Porchester. Now, why that?
That's just a piece of history, because earls are allowed to have an eldest son with a title that in the past wouldn't get you into the House of Lords, but it's still a title. So my eldest boy, George, is Lord Porchester. And
you were once?
Yeah, I was actually, and my father was for quite a long time, because my grandfather lived a long life. Yes, people are still amused because I race in colours for the horses, and my colours as Lord Porchester, not as Lord Carnarvon.
Oh, I see. Well, your father was very famous as Porchy, a great friend of the Queen's as well.
He was.
Didn't he managed the Queen's horses, didn't he?
He did for quite a long time, and he really enjoyed that. And Her Majesty was a friend over many years, and they both shared this extraordinary love of the thoroughbred racehorse and breeding the thoroughbreds, and both. And I think especially Her Majesty, even to this day, has an encyclopedic knowledge of all the bloodlines of the key racehorse families.
And there are some very famous pictures throughout the times of them absolutely going bonkers when one of the Queen's horses won at some race or other.
The famous one is when the Queen's horse Highclere won the French Oaks, the Prix d'Anne in France. Yes.
Oh, that must have been a marvelous moment. Oh, but I mean, and of course, anyone who watches The Crown will have seen your father being played as a character in The Crown as well. So there have been lots of members of your family actually shown up on television from time to time, and I'm thinking, of course, particularly of the 5th Earl, who was your great-grandfather.
Yes, my great-grandfather, yeah.
Who, of course, was involved in possibly the greatest archaeological find of all time, Tutankhamun. He
was an extraordinary Edwardian adventurer, and he had a passion for all sorts of things, really. Well, one of his great passions was early motor cars, and he had some of the earliest cars into England, the French early motor cars, and he had such a passion for it that over the years he had quite a number of quite severe accidents. He was very lucky. My extraordinary great-grandmother Almina nursed him back to life, really, after one very bad one in Germany. And then he was advised, because he sort of damaged his chest a bit, to go and spend winters in a warm, hot, dry climate. Hence, he went to Cairo, but he was much too much of an active man wanting to get involved in things. So he thought he'd have a quest, and he'd become an excavator. So he went down and lived in Luxor and Thebes, and began his work really as a gentleman amateur, but then became a consummate professional, and even more so with Howard Carter later. And they eventually triumphed in November 1922 after many years.
It's astonishing to think if he hadn't been quite such a daredevil in the motor cars and caused that accident that caused the doctors to say you really need to go somewhere warm for the winter, history might have unfolded slightly differently. We've got a lovely video explaining that. Let's have a quick look at this new Viking video about him. Karine Hagen takes up the story.
It was a morning much like any other for George Herbert. Enchanted by speed and undeterred by risk, the young 5th Earl of Carnarvon put his Panhard Levasseur motor car through its paces, perhaps a bit fast, just as he had 1,000 times before. But in the blink of an eye, life as he knew it was over. The crash was the ultimate stroke of bad luck, and a bleak future lay ahead, or so it seemed. The once dashing, carefree 5th Earl of Carnarvon was left with severe injuries and lungs so badly damaged he was told to avoid English winters. Lord Carnarvon needed to heal, but he also required more than just warm weather to revitalize his spirit.
So there he was, Lord Carnarvon in Egypt. He could have just sat back, enjoyed the sun and sipped cocktails. But as you said, he wasn't that sort of man. He wanted to get involved, and archaeology gripped him, didn't it?
It did. We have a great photo of him as a small boy looking at the Iron Age barrows here. So, where the burial grounds on the southern end of the estate. And I think he was always a man with a fascination for foreign lands. He travelled quite a bit. He even sailed right down to Argentina in a yacht on the Cape Horn, and then back to Africa. And he'd been on a very dangerous safari where he was nearly mauled by a charging buffalo. So he had his thrills and spills in life. But I think he got to Egypt. There was no way he was going to be just sitting back with a social scene in Cairo. He wanted to engage in a quest. He was fascinated by the ancient Egyptians, and he persuaded the French local chief inspector of antiquities, Gaston Maspero, to give him what was supposed to be a very unpromising area to explore in his first year, where after moving thousands of tons of rubble around about the 1904-05 season, all he found was a mummified cat and cat coffin, which you could still see in the animal mummy section of the Cairo Museum. It probably will be moved to their wonderful new museum soon, but I'm not quite sure when all that's happening. But he never gave up, and then as he got more practiced, he began to make some interesting discoveries himself around like the finds he made around Queen Hatshepsut, the famous Lady Pharaoh's mortuary temple, and some of those objects were actually left behind in a little cupboards between our drawing room and smoking room. We only found after my grandfather died.
Oh, we'll come to that story a bit later. But didn't he? It wasn't at even when he joined up with Howard Carter and they were beginning to make a name for themselves. At some point, didn't he really think he ought to give up? I mean, it was taking up an awful lot of his money. Was there one moment at which he said to Carter, "I don't think I can continue"?
Well, actually, that was quite late in the day. That was he actually gained the concession for the Valley of the Kings just before the outbreak of World War I, and then nothing much happened for a bit. And then they started again in the sort of 1819 season, and then by the time it came to 1921, then into the summer of 1922. Taxes were much higher after the war. Things were becoming expensive and difficult. And he did say to Howard Carter, maybe we just ought to perhaps quit on this whole idea. It's just becoming too difficult. But Carter, in a moment of great enthusiasm, said, "Come on, we've got to try for one more season." They had a famous meeting here in June 1922. There was a Newbury Races house party weekend. And Howard Carter says to my grandfather, "Look, I'll offer to pay for everything in the last season. Then my great-grandfather says, no, you can't possibly do that. Well, okay, we'll do it. We'll have one more season. We'll use an area where we haven't been allowed in the Valley of the Kings, because amazingly it had tourists running across it near some workmen's tombs of the great Ramesses pharaoh, and that's where they started in that autumn in 1922. And then my grandfather had gone home to be back at Highclere for a bit, and the famous telegram comes from Howard Carter. Mm-hmm. Have made wonderful discovery. Stop. Await your arrival. Can you imagine nowadays anyone awaiting arrival for that kind of thing? But
presumably it took him weeks to get there.
2 or 3 weeks in those days, yes, without flying, yes, yeah.
Yeah. So off he went, wondering, I presume, quite what Carter had found. And he was there. They were both gentlemen together. Actually, broke the final seal, or peeked into the room beyond, didn't they? It was what I call
together.
Yeah, it was the wonderful. Well, you describe it, because you're.
But it was the two of them, and also my great aunt, Lady Evelyn Herbert, who was with her father, and Carter. They break through the seal of the door. They have a flickering candle, and they're holding the candle just through into this dark space of the antechamber. And Carter's peering through, and Carnarvon says, "What can you see?" And famously, Carter says back, "Yes, wonderful things." And of course, Carter immediately later says it looked like the lost opera shop of a lost civilization, with everywhere the glint of gold and these extraordinary objects flickering in the darkness.
Well, we've got another little clip of video here from Viking, in which Karina Hagen describes really what they did manage to see inside. Have a look at this.
Hidden since 1322 BC, Tutankhamun's tomb is said to be the best preserved and most intact pharaonic tomb ever found in the Valley of the Kings. Overflowing with treasures it took a decade to catalogue. Sadly, Lord Carnarvon had very little chance to revel in the discovery. A simple mosquito bite led to pneumonia, and mere months later he was gone.
You never got to see the innermost shrine, the middle and the nested coffins, or indeed the extraordinary iconic golden mask. He died in the hour of his triumph in early April 1923.
The world overwhelmingly embraced the discovery, and people around the globe still queue up to view the astounding collection of more than 5,000 artifacts.
In his mind, he had this extraordinary idea that there was something there if you stuck at it long enough.
Lord Carnarvon's unwavering commitment in the face of impossible odds made him famous overnight. Yet back home in the halls of Highclere Castle, tales recounting the achievements and fame of the 5th Earl of Carnarvon were conspicuously absent, at least for one set of young ears.
So, Lord Carnarvon, it seems so sad that your great-grandfather, after all his years in Egypt, all his hard work and his belief as well in Howard Carter and the fact that they might in the end make it, he never got to see what was inside properly. He never got to see the gold mask, for instance.
No, we have this wonderful 8mm film here where he's seen taking objects out of the antechamber in February 1922. But then very sadly, at the end of March, he got sick and then died in the hour of his triumph in April 1922 from blood poisoning, and then eventually getting pneumonia, which is a great tragedy, and given how much he'd done for the world and all of humanity, really. So he never saw the golden mask. And interestingly, the first time my great aunt Evelyn saw the golden mask was when it came to London in 1972 at the famous exhibition at the museum. Because she left Egypt very soon after her father died, and it took Howard Carter many years to very carefully get everything out of the tomb, because it was so hard to get everything out of the innermost part of those nested sarcophagi.
Well, as you said, he died in the moment of his greatest triumph. He did at least know they'd found it, and he'd seen some of the treasures. But to never have seen that funerary mask seems such a shame. And of course, the manner of his death gave rise to or it was part of the deal that gave rise to the curse of King Tut. Because wasn't it said that his own dog at Highclere died at the very same moment?
There were two things happened. Yes, the dog extraordinarily died back here at Highclere, and the power, electricity at Cairo was suddenly cut for some time, and no one could ever understand why. So that happened. But really, the reason why he sort of left the scene for a short while it was such an extraordinary, emotionally intensive thing to find. The world's media were all over him and Howard Carter, and politics locally and internationally were getting involved. And he took himself off on a boat down the Nile just for a rest, really. But he got bitten by a mosquito on his face, which he didn't look after. And another slightly creepy thing about this was that he was bitten on the same place on his face as the thinnest and most weakest piece of gold on the golden mask, exactly in the same place.
Oh my goodness! Well, no wonder everybody went mad with the curse of King Tut.
Well, he got back to Cairo, and my great grandmother and the doctor flew out in one of de Havilland's early planes. Can you imagine that, all the way from Highclere to Cairo, and try to nurse him back? And astonishingly, he sort of fought off some of the blood poisoning element, but then he was so weak that when eventually he then got a bug for pneumonia, and of course there's no antibiotics because Fleming's discovery not yet made, and he very sadly passed away, and it was a tragedy, really.
It was a terrific tragedy, but my goodness, what a legacy he's left. So you pay full tribute to him as a character, I think, in your museum downstairs, which is where the kitchens should be, I guess, if you were filming for Downton Abbey.
Well, it was actually it was a part of a way where there was the lots of rooms for the staff and storage and wine stores and all these exciting things in the cellars, some of which we still have. But this area we've devoted as a tribute to him and Howard Carter. And great-grandfather, of course, was a fantastic early photographer. I mean, he actually won photography prizes, had exhibitions, which is why the photos we have of some of his time in Egypt, they're such high quality that we can reproduce them here and blow them up, and they're perfect.
Yes, and that's amazing because they were big glass plates, those very old-fashioned plates.
Absolutely.
Weren't they? But I'm told that they're better resolution than some high-quality digital cameras nowadays.
I think, yes. I remember the last time we used a traditional large plate camera here was to get a fantastic photograph of the amazing painting of Charles I in the dining room, because it was a better quality than you could get from a digital camera.
Isn't that amazing? So you pay tribute to him, and there's a lifelike figure of him as well, and I think it's lovely. You pay tribute to his character. You've even got his speeding tickets, because as we were saying, he's a daredevil driver.
It was amazing. There was a specialist lawyer to deal with speeding tickets right from 1905 onwards. That was when he used to drive to Newmarket because he loved the races. He was also a breeder of horses, and he loved races and a little bit of gambling. And he would drive through Epping Forest and get done for speeding.
At what speed do we know?
Well, probably about 25 miles an hour.
Oh well, those were the days. Yeah, and of course there's a lot of photographs, and of course of his wedding to Almina, who was an extraordinary character herself. Give us a bit of background on Almina.
Well, my great grandmother really was an extraordinary character. She was quite a sort of diminutive lady, but she had an extraordinary energy and desire to do things. She was fascinated by medicine, but she was also Alfred, the great banker, Alfred Rothschild's real daughter. She was illegitimate, but Alfred just adored her and showered quite a bit of his fortune on her, which was great for Highclere and also the things she wanted to do. And she turned Highclere into a fully operating hospital for the first 2 years of World War I.
And extraordinarily, I mean, such was his devotion to her that, as you said, even though officially she was illegitimate, which would have been a problem at the time, he made sure she was well educated. He even got her presented at court, didn't he?
He did. He went through the whole society thing, and the wedding was absolutely attended by the great and good of the time. But of course, Alfred was, remember, on the board of the Bank of England, involved in the key financing of the key projects of the time, the Suez Canal, that kind of thing. So he was a really top chap in the country. and Almina really shone as a powerhouse of energy and organisation. I mean, it was extraordinary for a woman. It sounds very sexist, but at the time you have to remember what it was like to get permission to set up a proper hospital and do all those things. And then she got a letter.
Her mind.
In the end, Kitchener wrote a letter to Alfred saying what a fantastic job Almina has done.
Well, let's take a look at another little video that explains just that and shows us the true picture.
In the period drama Downton Abbey, this imposing castle and way of life was kept alive by the wealth of an American heiress. A story of marriage and status that actually played out many times in real life. Over a period of 30 years, more than $20 billion in today's money came shuttling across the Atlantic to prop up Britain's aristocracies and their stately homes. The estate is in reality Highclere Castle, and its history is equally compelling, as it too was rescued by English heiress Almina Wombwell.
Lady Almina came here as a young 19-year-old bride in 1895. She was the daughter of Alfred de Rothschild. She was actually illegitimate and married Geordie's great-grandfather. She then acquired immediately a wonderful place in society. Really, her inheritance, which she brought here, is terribly important to the family, and it means we're still here today.
Much as in the television series, the world at Highclere Castle changed abruptly with the onset of World War I, and Lady Almina stepped forward, committing the estate to help support the war effort.
She turned Highclere into a hospital. She took in patients, officers who were wounded in the Somme, in Gallipoli.
Including officers from the Royal Flying Corps with the early aircraft who had broken bones but survived crashes.
She made such a difference to so many people's lives.
And that was the south side of Highclere, and they put up those big sun blinds, didn't they? Because it's so sunny on that side of the house.
It can actually be on a hot summer. You can actually get too warm in all those rooms on the south side. So I suspect that's why they did it for the patients during World War I.
Yes, absolutely. What happened to Almina?
Oh well, she actually had a wonderful, very long life. She died in her 90s. I remember her as a small boy, and my father. My father had a daughter and vice versa. And my father looked after her in her last few years because she'd rather sadly managed to rather sort of live off the capital rather than have income. So it's a bit tricky at the end. But she was fine, and she was a very strong character right until the moment she passed away.
Now, it's interesting there you mentioned your father and, of course, his father. One would have hoped, had not the fifth Earl died the way he did, that he would have taken his own children on his knee, and they in turn would have taken their children on their knee and told them all the wonderful stories about, digging for Tutankhamun. But it wasn't that way. It was, in fact, your grandfather didn't really want to know very much about the Egyptian story and the artifacts, did he?
I think he found the whole relatively sudden death of his father, age 56, very traumatic, because he was out in India as a young officer doing things as India part of the British Empire then, and he was a soldier there, and he had to come home and confront this tragedy. And of course, at that stage of the country, after World War I, death duties were a bit of a serious problem for anyone owning land and property, and they used to take most things away. And so my great-grandmother was amazing and helped him sort all that out. And luckily, Highclere managed to stay intact for the family. We could have many times everything went and then. But anyway, that stayed intact, even if the other parts of the property and estates went. But I think he did find it incredibly traumatic, and one of the reasons why he blocked off the cupboards with these objects. In 1924-5, Almina was quite clever, and to help pay the remaining death duties, sold the collection of her husband to the Metropolitan Museum in New York for about $125,000, which is a lot of money. Then. But Howard Carter said, as we know in his notes, a few less important items I've left at Highclere. and some of them were left in these cupboards, all in like cigarette boxes and Turkish boxes and things, between the drawing room and the smoking room.
We're just seeing a picture there of your father and his father opening a cupboard.
No, that was my father, and after my grandfather died, that's my father and the equivalent of Carson, Robert Taylor, the butler.
Oh.
Because my father
tell us the story then, because he knew where these things were, didn't he?
Yes, because my father was doing a final inventory, as you have to do, of everything. And Robert says to my father, "Oh, my lord, the final thing to look at is the Egyptian stuff." And my father said, "What are you talking about? That's all in Cairo or in New York." And Robert says, "No, absolutely not. There's some in the cupboards between the drawing room and the smoking room," which my grandfather at his older age, he'd blocked them off with furniture so you couldn't go through those doors, and he denuded the drawing room of lots of nice things which he'd sold just to keep himself going. So the drawing room was just not even used really. And anyway, all this was all sorted out, and then I remember I was in my early 30s then, because my grandfather died about aged 88. I remember my father showing me these objects, like little faience balls and the little ladies' tweezers and makeup things from Hatshepsut's temple, 3,000 years old, all in a pretty extraordinary good condition. But they left in the dark at Highclere for some 60 odd plus more years in the dark and at an even temperature. It was actually a very good way of keeping them. But anyway, they're now all in glorious display in our Egyptology exhibition in the cellars for people.
Well, that's it. And for anyone whoever manages to come to Highclere and have a look, your Egyptian museum, which we're seeing now, is a splendid work. I don't know how you've done it. How do you set up a museum? How do you do it? Who do you
go maybe
to?
Fiona and I did it after my pa died to create a tribute to the two men, and probably because we didn't really know how you did it, we actually managed to do it. Because had we realised later how much work it was going to be, we might have thought differently. So we allocated ourselves different jobs, and we did a year presenting all the real antiquities. And my wife, darling wife Fiona, is very, very scholarly. She did a lot of the background on Egyptology and hieroglyphs. And then we had another 18 months when we had to find the replicas of Tutankhamun's tomb and source them, get them made, and do all that side of it. And so it was a fairly extraordinary project. I think we spent so much time down there in the near darkness. We were like moles in the ground sometimes.
But the replicas themselves are absolutely splendid. I mean, you really think you're looking at the real thing.
They're are. We found an extraordinary place where these were, and somehow we managed to get them. And some were made in Egypt, and one or two were made in the movie studios for us. But they are fantastic, high quality, and you'd hardly know the difference. I always say that the painted chest is my Thomas Crown affair object. You could swap it and no one would ever know.
Oh, that's an interesting one. I love the way you've recreated the "what do you see, wonderful things" moment. You've got little places you can look in, and you can open up the trapdoor and have a look inside, and you get the same sort of vision that Carter and Carnarvon must have had when they first looked through.
It's the idea to recreate the looking through in the antechamber, and everywhere the glint of gold, with the chariot wheels, the guardian statues, Goddess Hathor, and the rest. And you look through. We've actually, for the sake of the COVID-19 guidance, we've had to take the little lids off. So now you look through without lifting anything up, because you mustn't be touching. But otherwise, it's very effective. I actually said to Fiona, I think it's even better now. Anyway, it works fine.
It makes it exciting. It really does. Do you understand? I mean, I know you've been to Egypt many, many times. Do you love it? Do you understand what motivated your great-grandfather so?
We do love Egypt. It's a really extraordinary place. The Nile has this sort of romantic attachment to it. And even today, if you're staying in the Winter Palace Hotel and it's early in the morning and you can look out back across the river towards Thebes and the Valley of the Kings, it is an extraordinary sort of spiritual thing in a way. And of course, for my great grandfather, although he was living in the hotel quite often and rather than literally out in the dust, he also did live out in the dust and the stones of the desert with Howard Carter, and he actually helped Carter build a house for himself known as Castle Carter, not far from the entrance of the Valley of the Kings.
Which you can still see.
You can visit today, and we help the Egyptian authorities with graphic panels explaining great-grandfather's involvement.
Oh, there's no doubt your family now has this indelible link with ancient Egypt. So let's come right to the present day and Downton Abbey. How much of a coup was it for you to become the main location for that filming?
Well, it was extraordinary and an amazing piece of great fortune. Of course, none of us, even they wouldn't have known the success that was going to happen from it. And Julian Fellows, Julie and Emma we'd known, and you know, they came early on to have a look with all the location scouts, and then spent quite some time just going all around the country. And actually, to be honest, we actually thought for one stage that they were never coming back. And we were going to even give up on it and take it out of the diary. But then we got this extraordinary frantic call from them. I think we were away in the middle of nowhere in Umbria. Luckily, where the mobiles are working very well. And they said, right, we're going for Highclere, come home, let's get it all sorted. And then, you know, and then we said to them, well, is it going to be a success if it has 2 million viewers or a bit more? Is it just going to get by? And then we noticed that it began to creep up and up. And then, of course, it became a blockbuster, and then it ended up with 11 or 12 million viewers in the UK. And I gather that throughout the world, it's now been seen by 250 million people or more.
Yes, and of course, it makes Highclere one of the most recognised places on earth, as I said. Funnily enough, it really does, doesn't it? How do you feel?
We are very lucky. I mean, it's great for British heritage. There are many of these wonderful houses to visit in Great Britain, and if it just helps people come to the country and enjoy our fantastic heritage of our long history of this extraordinary island, and if I could compare part in just the introduction bit, and then people have a great time wherever, then we've done our part in it.
Oh, absolutely. How do you protect all this? I mean, look at the books behind you, and I know they've filmed a lot in that room. All the books, the beautiful ceilings. In some rooms you have silk wall coverings, and in the main ancient leather wall coverings.
Yeah, from Cordoba.
How do you protect all of that from what I know from my business is, you know, the rough and tumble of a TV crew coming in with actors and actresses all over the place? And how do you protect all the things that must be protected?
Well, actually, people often say to us, why weren't you always negotiating for parts as extras in that side of the camera? By far the most important job for Fiona and I was to be the other side of the camera, making sure that everything was organised properly and was going to be safe and wasn't going to cause any problems. And I mean, you know, I think with film crews, you just have to be quite firm and organised from the word go, and then everything mostly works out okay. You get the odd bit of damage, you can't help that, but you don't want a big piece of damage. But otherwise, the thing that damages the interiors of all these places around the country is the south facing side of the car, is UV light from the sun. And of course, it totally ruined the silk wall covering, in the glorious silk wall covering that was a part of my great grandparents' wedding present from Alfred. But then my parents redid that in the year 2000. But now we have ultraviolet protection on all the windows there.
Oh, I see. Isn't that interesting that nature is one of the worst culprits?
Yes, UV light's very bad on fabrics.
Very. And yet, obviously you would build it with a beautiful south-facing facade because you want to enjoy the sun if you're of the family there. How do you feel about sharing what is inherently your family home with the world?
Well, we've enjoyed it. I mean, it's amazing to come across people here from all quarters of the world. I remember the first day we ever had an online ticket here. The first two families, one was from the Philippines and the other one was from Moscow. So I never forgot that moment. And people from everywhere have been here for all the different types of events. Obviously, as we've discussed before, many of our supporters and visitors are from North America, from the United States and Canada. And of course, the family has a big connection with the United States because both my father's mother and my own mum were from the United States.
Yes, that's right. It's a long tradition of it, really, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
And of course, as I said earlier, it's more than a strong rumour that there's going to be a second movie. So no doubt Highclere will be involved again. But you did go en famille, actually, to the big movie premiere, didn't you? And I know we've got a lovely picture of you here with Karina Hagen from Viking, which brings us on to your relationship with Viking, because I know they've sponsored a lot of your events, and you continue to have a very strong relationship with Viking.
We do, and if you remember earlier on this evening, we talked about the Dormer family from the earlier Earls of Carnarvon, and it was from Michael and Daphne Dormer, who live close by, who are great friends of Karina Hagen, that we first met Karina. I remember Karina came on a day here when we were having a terrible problem with water pressure. It was all rather a drama. She must have thought, what on earth was his family doing, wondering why they couldn't make water work properly. But anyway, we've had a great and wonderful friendship with Karina, and we love Viking Cruises as a company. It's just a fantastic family business. Again, aiming for the highest quality of service, great imagination in everything they do, wonderful trips all around the world. And it's just great to have an association with them, because of course, when I know it's very sad at the moment because of the virus, it's all very difficult with cruises, but when it's all been going well, so many people on Viking trips have stopped off and visited Highclere.
Yes. And of course, Karina's beautiful dog, Finzer, was one of the puppies born.
Yes, she was one of.
So there's an even stronger.
One of our wonderful, now passed away, Bella Labrador's 10 puppies, and Finzer grew up here. There they all are, and that family is still going today. And now Karina has Charlie, and we have Stella and Freya, and those three were born in Karina's cottage, where she stays on the estate.
That's a lovely picture. Yes, there are always a lot of dogs around, aren't there?
There are, yeah.
And of course, Viking also sponsored that big exhibition in London recently. I think we saw some pictures from it earlier.
The Saatchi Gallery, the Tutankhamun show, was a wonderful show. It was they had the fantastic objects there, and they were so well presented and displayed. Some of the best that I've ever seen in terms of explanations. It was brilliant.
Yes, it was. It was lovely. And actually, funnily enough, my son tweeted me to a surprise birthday present, and it was a ticket to that very show. So I was along there as well. It's lovely to see. There we are. There's me and Connor, who's helped on so many of these Viking live streams, and his girlfriend Dana, who's from the States. It was a brilliant. Those are my two favourite statues as well of Tutankhamun. I love those, and you've got some really good replicas of those downstairs, haven't you, as well? Looking ahead, other elements of life and the history of Highclere, I was fascinated to come as well. You invited me to the opening of this beautiful statue of an airman carved out of one solid piece of Highclere wood, because there have been so many during World War II. I think there were so many airmen shot down in your grounds.
Well, actually, there was quite a lot of tragedies of deaths of airmen. They weren't, in fact, mostly shot down. They were in training accidents. And one of the most tragic of all was the B-17 crew, who had been over Germany many times and survived. Were just doing a little flying round from Greenham Common Air Base around here. And of course, they hadn't really understood their altitude correctly. And in English bad weather, they managed to clip the top of the hill behind the castle, which goes up to nearly 900 feet above sea level. One of those people survived that tragedy, and he only died not so long ago, but his family have been to visit Highclere.
And it's been a bit of a quest. I tell you what, well, let's have a look at another little clip from one of these Viking videos that everybody can watch at their leisure. This is a little clip, though, from Lady Carnarvon's At Home at Highclere for Viking episodes, about those very airmen who crashed at Highclere and the quest to try and at least tell their families where they may have fallen.
It was such a sad, terrible tragedy, and it was one of pure accident. They were flying on a training exercise. Unlike today, when it's a beautiful sunny day, it was more like a week ago when it was pouring with rain, low crowd and fog. And they came down in this extraordinary huge engine of this plane. Everybody heard it circling twice over the castle as the airmen were trying to find their way towards Greenham Common, which is 7 miles away, or another airbase. And sadly, they then turned and flew south into the fog, and also into the only high hill around here, at about 900 foot above sea level. They tried to pull up to get past it, but sadly didn't. I found out about the remains of the B-17 of this story when I was finishing writing a book called Lady Catherine, The Real Downton Abbey, which took Highclere through the 20s and 30s, the Downton Abbey time, and then into the Second World War. I loved writing it, but at the end was the beginning of my journey, finding the stories of these airmen. Not merely was there a B-17 that crashed, I have since found, with the help of a wonderful man called Steve Bohill-Smith and Paul McTaggart, who's standing here with me, the remains of 7 other planes. And the airmen flying in them, the aircrew, they were sons, they were brothers, they were husbands, and most of the families never knew where their loved ones had died. So it has been one of our missions to try and find the families and to, if you like, reunite them with what happened at the end so they can come and pay their remembrances, and we can all say thank you to them.
It's amazing, but there is always something going on at Highclere. I guess when you've got something that is so big and with such a history, there's always something for you to do, isn't there?
You know, there's always something happening here. And we never take any of the scenery or the house or the incredible area around here for granted, really. It's just always another project, one way and another.
And one of your latest projects, which I gather is proving to be quite a hit, is the gin, Highclere Gin. Who came up with that idea?
Well, there were 2 things happened in a sort of different way and a sort of parallel way, and then suddenly crossed over, and it was extraordinary. I've always loved our Victorian orangery, not far from the castle, which is full of, you know, subtropical fruits and lemons, oranges, and the lavender nearby and the rest. And then my friend from the US, Adam Gutkin, sent me an email 5 years back saying, "Why didn't you create a spirit?" And then somehow the 2 things got going together, and then we launched Highclere Castle Gin a year back, really, and the botanical side of it was all from endless tastings and creations from the orangery.
And something you might not have done before, I suppose. You were thinking about how to socially distance people, how people would go down after lockdown, and you've arranged a sort of cocktail bar area just by the herb garden.
Yes, the cocktail bar area, we had a little bit of a go last year. We've sort of upgraded it for this year, and it's right by our wonderful herb garden. And Lewis, our extraordinary butler, who's a great mixologist and cocktail maker, comes up with a new gin cocktail sort of every day, really, and they're great fun.
Now that sounds like a really nice way to spend the summer. So what about other events? I mean, are you now trying to keep a normal sort of calendar up to Christmas? And again, Christmas at Highclere is always something special. Do you think you'll be able to do it this year?
Yes, we Christmas at Highclere, in a wonderful Victorian building, is special. I think it'll be a little bit more challenged this year because of the social distancing guidance, because we have had these wonderful Christmas fairs here, but of course they're around the Christmas fair, people are really quite close to each other, so that may not be possible. But we'll try our best to definitely do something leading up to. We'll have a great big Christmas tree in the saloon as ever, and we'll come up with some things. But we do have a full program of events for people to visit with different themes all the way into the autumn, even when we're not full on properly open like we are today.
I'm sure you'll find a way. Absolutely. We've got lots of questions coming in. Shall we tackle a couple? Sure. Now, this is a really good one, I think. From Val Unga in Sunderidge. Which one of the previous Earls of Carnarvon do you most closely identify with, and why?
Well, yes, the family motto up on all the stone is Unga servere, which is only one will I serve in Norman French. And when my grandfather was asked that question, he always just said me in rather a loud voice. But he was a great character and raconteur of the time. But actually, probably it would have been amazing to have been the first Earl of Carnarvon in his time. He dealt with the calm down the Gordon riots in London. That's why he was recognised by George III. The ancestor, the fourth Earl, was a fantastic politician during the Victorian period and served in. It was colonial secretary when the map of the world was quite some thing. There are even 2 towns named after him. In fact, 3 in Canada, South Africa, and Western Australia. And then his son, the fifth Earl. It's invidious to think of which one I would have been like, because they were all such amazing characters in their own way.
Well, you'll have to stick to me then, I think, don't you? Me, I did it my way, sort of thing.
Oh, well, sure, yeah.
And now Vicky Peoples from Hayden Lake says, does your family actually own those Egyptian artifacts? How did you sort that out?
We own the ones that we have here in the building, but everything that was found in the tomb belongs to the state and country of Egypt. In fact, had my great-grandfather lived, he would have had a right to have actually taken some of the objects from the tomb, because that was in the deal. But he sadly died, and then probably the general feeling was it was best to leave things where they were. And in fact, Howard Carter did a great job in moving everything over a 10-year period from the tomb to the current museum, which my great-grandmother kept on paying for, which in a very fair way. And the Egyptian government did, in fact, kindly pay for some of that element back. But I think that was fair. I think it's right that they stay with the Egyptian people in Cairo, really.
Yes, absolutely, and go out there to see them. And you can even take in better days, you'll be able to take a trip on a Viking cruise.
Absolutely, I'm longing to go on a Viking cruise.
That's
down the
way
road.
to do it. It's definitely the way to do it. Sharon Trakler from Concord in New Hampshire says, what gives you the most pleasure yourself personally? Your gardens are obviously beautiful and the animals we've seen are lovely, but what gives you personally the most pleasure about living there?
It's actually, it's a great question, but it's actually just being out and about on the estate and this incredible chalk down landscape and this amazing parkland and trees that my ancestors had the foresight to plant and design. I mean, the third Earl of Carnarvon, I suppose Robert Herbert was the first Herbert here, and he first had the ideas for all this, even before Capability Brown, sometime later. And then the first
Capability Brown, of course, did.
Well, the first Earl was commissioned Capability Brown to do more work all around in the parkland. But Robert Herbert began it, and I was only today happily looking at trees that we've planted to recreate one of Robert Herbert's amazing avenues. And he was the one that built all these extraordinary follies that, to be honest, are a bit of a headache for us today.
Oh yes, but they're lovely, aren't they? I mean, I know the whole idea of.
Heaven's Gate looking out to the south, the Temple of Diana, which is a beautiful building out as you leave the park over the lake. I mean, what more idea of paradise can you create in a place like Highclere?
Yes, oh, absolutely. But do you have to think then, are you always constantly thinking of leaving a legacy, thinking of the future? Because obviously 3 or 4 centuries ago, people planted those trees, which we consider so magnificent and huge now. I presume you have to do some planting for generations in the future.
We've done a lot here, and we continue to do it. And there are, in fact, the cedars on the east lawn, which are now getting up to a reasonable size, they were planted as small trees after the terrible storm in January 1990. And you can see the old stumps are still there. But no, I think people who live and own these amazing places, they're tenants or stewards for their lifetime, and they have to try and leave it in a better condition than when it started, so that future generations can enjoy it in the same way. That's the whole idea of them, really.
Was there ever a moment in history where you might have had to give it up and hand it over to, I don't know, National Heritage or something? Was it ever in danger of not being in the family? I think
there's always a time with economic factors, businesses, family things where these places can be in that condition. I mean, obviously, even very recently, Fiona and I were pretty alarmed and sleepless when we were advised we had to shut down for possibly months on end. So you go from having a business which is bringing in income and surviving to one that's doing absolutely nothing, and that's an absolute threat to it. And that applies to all these kind of places. But we hope and pray to God that we can somehow move forward from this. But there's a vaccine eventually for the virus, and the world comes back to a normal situation, and we can all be, as Her Majesty said, meet again.
Absolutely. And it really meant something when she said that, didn't it?
It
really
yeah.
did. Yes, your godmother, I think. Susan Cody from Austin in Texas says, thank you so much, Lord Carnarvon, for sharing your family's history and showing us behind the scenes at Highclere. And we are loving the Highclere Gin. They must have sent for some.
Oh,
and Catherine O'Brien from Parkland said, what a wonderful castle in England. I think it's amazing that we're able to hear and see so much history. It's gone down very well. Thank you so much for joining me today. Go and have a really nice stiff gin and tonic.
I think I will. Thank you very much, and it's been great to be with you on Viking TV. Great pleasure.
Oh, it's been lovely. Thank you very, very much indeed. It's been wonderful to hear your stories too. Thank you. And don't forget, there's Lady Carnarvon's podcast, which if you're a fan, you can listen to. Just go to highclerecastle.co.uk, easy to get to. I recently did an interview with Lady Carnarvon on with Anne and Nick, which is on YouTube. You just look for With Anne and Nick. And of course, Lady Carnarvon is at home at Highclere every Friday here on Viking TV. So if you're a fan, there's an awful lot for you to dig into. But thanks for the moment very much to Lord Carnarvon for what has been a wonderful Thursday evening broadcast. Now to my next guest. Should be very interesting. The Vikings were a very interesting group of explorers. And though history has labelled them as rapists and pillagers, they were, in fact, explorers and tradesmen who connected cultures as far from their Scandinavian homes as Istanbul in the south and east to North America in the west. Their skills at shipbuilding have survived the ages, and their clinker building style, yes, clinker building, is seen today not only on most wooden boats in Norway, but the caravels in Portugal and even the gondolas of Venice. So next week's guest is Geir Røvik, I hope I've pronounced that properly, who knows more about Viking life and culture than possibly any living human, and even spends much of his life living like one, I am told. He should be an absolutely fascinating man to meet. So do join me, Anne Diamond, same time, same place, here on Viking Television, and we'll have another wonderful story for you to hear and see. In the meantime, stay safe and well, won't you? Bye-bye.